Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I do have notes because I've got to bring them up because my staffer who wrote them for me is sitting here. So thank you for preparing my notes, but I'm not very good at reading. Not because I can't read, just because I tend to go off on a tangent, and particularly when it's about a subject that I am so passionate about. So for my sins, I am Shadow Water Minister. I'm also Shadow Emergency Management Minister and Deputy Leader of the Federal Nationals. There are lots of familiar faces in this room, and some of them are familiar because I have a long history in the water space. I was employed by a company called Murray Irrigation in 2010 on a 12-month contract to help them navigate the implementation of the Basin Plan. What a gift that keeps on giving, because I have been doing my utmost to get out of water ever since. And here I am. I got into politics to get out of water, and I'm right back where feels like where I started from. But a lot has happened in the 13 years that I've been operating in the water space. We do have a basin plan. It was tabled in 2012 and passed with bipartisan agreement. It was hard fought. Industry spent a lot of time at the table with environmental groups, with others, trying to come up with what we used to lovingly say the least worst plan. What is the least damage that can happen in our rural and regional communities in the basin? Because we all want a better environment, and we all know that things needed to change. But how much change and how quickly that change occurs can make or break a regional community. So we dealt with that. When the Coalition came into government in 2013, we introduced a cap on buybacks because we wanted to shift the focus from the, as the Wentworth Group calls it, the cheapest form of water recovery, and in theoretically, for $1 per megalitre, it is the cheapest. And it is the easiest, because you just go out with a tender, you take in the applications, and then you fill in the paperwork, job done. But it's not the most effective for the environment nor for communities. So in government, the Coalition brought in a cap on buybacks at 1,500 gigalitres. Again, though, with bipartisan support. The Labor Party came on board with that. There was also another hard-fought section of the Basin Plan, which is Chapter 7 of the Basin Plan, which is a swings and roundabouts, for want of a better word. And I apologise, because sometimes I get accused of gigababble, because I can rattle off the numbers like there's no tomorrow. I can talk gigalitres, megalitres. The one thing I struggle with is Sydney Harbours. I'm not very good at that. I'm getting better. But I'll try and keep it simple. But Chapter 7 of the Basin Plan is an adjustment mechanism. Up and down, simple. Because the Basin Plan had a recovery target. And that was 2750. Can we deliver the water better to get better environmental outcomes, meaning we don't need to get as much? Yes, we estimate by about that much, so that goes down. And then other people were like, but if we're going to do that, can we get better environmental outcomes if we address constraints and blockages in the system, and we can get more water? So it's a seesaw. That went through with bipartisan support. Couple of caveats in that. The more water part had to have neutral or positive socio-economic outcomes. That was written in by Tony Burke. He's Labor. When you listen to the new minister, and she says that part of the Basin Plan has been sabotaged by the Nationals and by the Coalition with brown tape, we did not write that into the Basin Plan. That was written in by Tony Burke. It had bipartisan support, and when we took over government, we adhered to that socio-economic neutrality test. We also sat down with all the state government ministers in the basin and said, what does that mean? how do we assess projects to ensure that they are socio-economically neutral? They came up with a criteria, a checklist, for want of a better word, and they still abide by that. What is happening now, however, is a complete step away from that bipartisan nature. It's a complete step away from protecting our irrigation-dependent communities. Declaration of interest. I live in an irrigation-dependent community. I live in Deniliquin. Back in 2012, the research was done by Marsden Jacobs, and they found that Deniliquin was 90%, the economy of Deniliquin was 90% dependent on irrigated agriculture. Every hairdresser in town, every butcher, every small business, the jewellery shop, my favourite shop in town, they're all dependent on irrigated agriculture. Now, not every person in Deniliquin is an irrigated farmer, and not every farmer in the district is an irrigated farmer. But such is the links between irrigation and the community in Deniliquin. That's how dependent we are on irrigated agriculture. So the Water Minister, through what she claims is consultation, which has been an online survey, one webinar, and a handful of invite-only on-site meetings only with departmental officials, has produced the Water Amendment Restoring Our Rivers Bill 2023. She says it will ensure all options are on the table to ensure we get that extra 450 gigalitres, which is the upside of the seesaw, not the downside, the upside. She's going to extend the timeframes to get that upside, but also extend the timeframes to get the downside, so the states can deliver infrastructure projects to get better environmental outcomes. She's going to remove the cap on buyback so that she can buy the water instead of doing infrastructure projects for the water. She's going to set a roadmap for addressing constraints in the river system. So there are choke points within the river that actually physically mean that you cannot exceed certain levels of water delivery unless you've made agreements with the riparian landholders, raised some bridges and culverts and all that sort of stuff. But she says she's taking a no regrets approach. So if they can't relax the constraints, it doesn't matter, she's going to get the water regardless, even if the water can't be used for optimal environmental outcomes. And a few other amendments. The other thing she's done, because she's not stupid, she's actually very, very politically smart, is she's tied in to this bill water market reforms. Now, the industry has been calling for water market reforms for ages. Lex would know all about this. The Australian water brokers support water market reform. Farmers, buyers and sellers support water market reform. I support water market reform. But she's saying take it or leave it. It's all or nothing. I did say to her, can't we separate them out? Because they're two separate things. You can reform the water market. You can incorporate, a code of conduct for water brokers, which most water brokers would already meet because they do it voluntarily. The industry has changed a lot in 13 years. Once upon a time, there were cowboys all over the place. Most of those cowboys have gone out of business. Most water brokers today are good corporate citizens, and they voluntarily meet their code of conduct because that is how they get repeat business. So I said, separate them out. You've got a win. You can go out with a win on water market reform. Even though, do I like everything the way she's set it out? Maybe not. There's a few things that I would do differently, but it's palatable. And she said, no, it's all or nothing. So I have spoken to some water brokers and I've said, how broken is the market? Like, how much do you need the fix? Correct me if I'm wrong. Lex is looking at me. He's giving me the side eye here. Most of them have said, well, yes, we want the reform, but we can live with the market as it is today because it is not that broken. It's not terminal, and we're already operating under our voluntary code of conduct. So she's actually lost a big negotiating tool if she thought that I would cave just to get water market reform in. The bigger issues for me are the issue about socio-economic protections for communities. She keeps saying to me, farmers want to sell me their water. I'm getting phone calls all the time. Farmers want to sell me their water. And don't get me wrong, there are farmers out there who do. I'm trying to help the Shiraz industry as best as I can. But they're on their knees. Our wine grape industry is currently, really struggling. And there are some farmers, they're later stage in life and they're going, is it worth it? I can sell my water. And when I say, well, you can sell your water tomorrow. I know some great exchanges who'll list your water for you. And they're like, but the government will pay me more. So they're already waiting for a government premium and they get their water and they turn around to their 5 employees and say, thanks for coming, but I'm ripping out my grapes because I'm moving to the coast. I'm retiring with dignity, which is their right, and I support every farmer who wants to do that. See you later to the employees. They rip out their farm, off they go. There's less grapes going to the press. Those 5 employees have just packed up their dilly bags because they can't get another job. So they've left town. They've taken their kids. Their kids have left the small school. The small school says, we've gone from 6 teachers to 5 teachers. So that teacher then packs up their dilly bags and they leave town. And then all of a sudden the medical centre's like, we don't need 4 nurses anymore. We only need 3 nurses. None of us can get doctors anyway, so that's, a whole nother. But that is the snowball effect. And then when you stretch it out, so you've lost some of the grape growers, because they'll be the first to go. But then the water price goes up. The temporary water price goes up because they haven't fixed demand. Because that one farm that's just sold their water, well, they probably weren't using that much water anyway, but they were selling their water on the temporary market every year. So they haven't fixed demand. And there are still thousands of hectares of almonds going in downstream of the Murray. And there are still thousands of hectares of winter cereals being grown, of rice being grown, of dairy pastures being grown, and everyone still wants to grow with their water. But they are now paying more for it. Not only are they paying more for it, for the wet stuff, they're paying more to get it delivered because the Commonwealth Government doesn't pay for the infrastructure charges. So they go up. So all of a sudden, dairy's starting to struggle. I'm from a rice growing district. Deniliquin has the largest rice mill in the Southern Hemisphere. At its peak, it employs 200 people. Rice will be the next to go because rice is not a high premium crop. When the rice economies of scale fall, Deniliquin rice mill will be mothballed. Now we're not talking about 5 people losing their jobs. We're talking about 200 people losing their jobs because you've got the people who work at the mill, you've got the truckies who drive the rice to the mill. And there is just not the economic adjustment. So when the minister says to me, it's okay, I've got a compensation package ready to go. I say, oh, that's nice. How much? Can't tell you that. It'll be announced later. How will it be distributed? oh, well, in New South Wales, because New South Wales have rolled over and said we'll take any coin we can get, Victoria has said, no, we're not playing ball, we're not signing up. So in Victoria, the money's going straight to community. In New South Wales, it gets to go through the department. Call me a cynic, but departments charge admin fees. So just saying. But a compensation package. Can a compensation package deliver the economic adjustment that is going to be required, not just in Deniliquin, but in Dirranbandi? Because the other thing she's done is she's removed, once upon a time, this magic bucket of water was going to be from the south only. She said, no, I'll get it from anywhere. I'll get it from wherever it comes. I think someone suggested to a Cubby Station was going to be on the market. Well, I spoke to Cubby Station's owners and they're like, it's not on the market. But places like Dirranbandi are now at risk. They're on notice. The Guida, up around Guida, Gundawindi, Mungandai, Burke, Griffith, Shepparton, Renmark in South Australia. I love seeing the South Australian ministers coming out saying, we need buyback. Absolutely, 100% we need buyback, but they're not getting it from South Australia because it's all upstream irrigators that are causing the problems. I can tell you, the red wine grape growers around Renmark and Berry and the Barossa are ready to sell. Water will go from South Australia. And the problem you have, particularly in the south, is it is a connected market. So it doesn't matter. You can say we're going to ring fence, we'll protect Victoria, we'll protect South Australia, we'll just buy from New South Wales. Fine. But that is water that comes out of a market that is connected. So it will impact farmers in South Australia and Victoria because it will impact their prices they're paying for temporary water, and it will impact the overall market. So water is a hugely complex policy area, interjurisdictional arrangements and relationships. But when you actually break it down to the community and the society, it is quite simple. We cannot grow the food and fibre that we do without water. We have already recovered 8 to 10 Sydney harbours. See, I've been practicing that. For the environment since we started focusing on this in the 1990s. The Basin Plan itself has recovered 4.5 Sydney harbours already. And she wants to buy another Sydney harbour when I know for a fact, and I've been talking to people who know, that there are better ways we can do this. There are better ways we can achieve the environmental outcomes we want to achieve, because fixing the environment is not just about adding water. As anyone who's as skillful a gardener as I am knows, if you just keep pouring water on your rose bush, it dies. It's not just add water. There's a whole array of things we can do. We can get smarter. Where do we want the drought refuges to be? How about we stop the poor little fish swimming into walls going, damn, and actually put fishways in? One of the biggest impediments, which was found in the New South Wales inquiry into the fish deaths at Menindee, is not volume, but it's fish passage. It's complementary measures. It's addressing things like cold water pollution. It's addressing riparian vegetation and water quality, which is not just about adding more water. So there is a lot we can do. Smarter, better ways. And I have, since I took this role on, and my first meeting with the minister, I did say to her, extend the deadlines. I want the deadlines extended. And then I will work with you and we will get better at how we manage our water, because what it should be is about management. And I'll just also put it in, I know you read the Wentworth group of concerned scientists reports, and it's always devastating, and the basin plan's failing, and we've achieved nothing in 13 years. I'll tell you some of the things we have achieved. For 10 years straight, we have kept the Coorong connected to the lower lakes, and that hadn't happened before. In the last drought, 2018 to 19, we kept the Murray flowing at a rate such that South Australia, even though it was a drought and due to the lovely water accounting regime we have, they went below their normal rate of water flow, but they still got more than 2,000 gigalitres of water over the border each year in drought, when my irrigators were on 0% and when Victorian irrigators were down around 20%. We still kept the environmental flows going to South Australia, and we still kept the Coorong and the lower lakes going. We have seen bird breeding events off the scale. We've seen the supposed goanna water that was purchased up in the northern basin flowing into the Narran Lakes. And we've seen fantastic bird breeding events up at the Narran Lakes for the first time in 30 or 40 years. We are getting outcomes. But no one wants you to hear the good news, because if it's working, how do you justify ripping more water out of our communities? I want you to hear the good news. The other good news story is what the Basin Plan is actually about. What the objectives of the Basin Plan are about is capping how much water we take from our rivers year on year. It's called a sustainable diversion limit. The other good news is, even without the swings and roundabouts that I was talking about, even without quite getting to the 2750, every river valley is operating under that cap. So if we're already operating under the cap, why do we keep needing to spend taxpayers' money taking more water out of our regional economies and doing the damage that's done? And I don't know, I can't speak for the bankers in the room, but if I was a banker, I'd be watching it very, very closely, because the impact on the asset that is held by farmers, the farmers that retain their water, good on them, because their asset's going to go up in value. But the farmers who sell their water and think they're going to continue to farm, I think the banks might be having a pretty good look at that arrangement. So there's a lot to consider. But I am focused on the communities. I'm focused on the economic impact. And I think there's better ways we can do water reform in this country than to keep doing, what do they say? Do the same thing again and expect a different outcome. We have had 4 lots of water reform since the turn of the century, all aimed at taking water off farmers and putting it back into the river. And they keep saying we need more. Let's start to look at it differently, and let's start to get a better outcome. And I'm happy for questions.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Peter Book. I'm from a small crop insurance company in Sydney. I just wondering if you could talk about the fact that, as I understand it, water is allocated by states, and that the only people who are buying water is the federal government, and that the federal government doesn't own the water other than the water that it buys. And that mismatch in that equation and how that translates into the outcome, both in a commercial sense and also in a political sense, where you have changing allegiances between states and federal politics.
Very good question. Very astute. You're absolutely right. The states still manage water. Our constitution, very, some would say sensibly, some would say not, kept water management and control in the state's hands. Each state treats water differently, but essentially you have a licence to access water. And then to that licence each year, depending on whether it's a drought year or otherwise, you get allocated a percentage. So one water licence equals 1 megalitre in New South Wales, and then you get allocated, so you might get 20% this year. So you'll get 20% of 1 megalitre in any given year. And you're absolutely right. The Commonwealth Government can't take water, it has to buy, has determined that it would bridge the gap. So it is buying a piece of paper. It is buying the licence to access that water in any given year. But, and it was a really strong fighting point back in the day, that whatever they've bought, whatever water product they've purchased, has the same characteristics as the farmer. So there are different levels, different sort of reliability rates. But for example, in Deniliquin, we're general security, which is low reliability. So for the benefit of the room, in New South Wales, the hierarchy of distributing water, the environment gets the first batch because you've got to get the rivers to run. If the rivers aren't running, no one can get water. So that is the first batch. Then there's critical human needs, gets the second batch. Then towns and urban water supplies get the next. Then high security, so your permanent plantings, your grapes, your almonds, your citrus. And then general security, broadacre cropping, are the opportunistic farmers. You know, they're the real gamblers in the mix because they never know whether they're going to get any or not. But when the government went to purchase their water, and when they were first started purchasing water in 2008, they did not have a basin plan. So they just went out and said, who's going to sell me your water? And we'll take anything from anywhere, without even thinking where they wanted to use the water or how they would get it there. One massive batch of water that Penny Wong, as the water minister, bought was up in central western New South Wales, Terrell Station. And she made a big announcement at the time. This water is going to return, 200 gigalitres to the Murray-Darling system every year. That water is very opportunistic water. Those rivers don't flow year in, year out. She bought pieces of paper and then found out that, by the way, to reconnect that water to the river, you've got to take that down this on-farm infrastructure. So they sent ecologists out, and the ecologists went out there and said, well, if you remove those levee banks, you're actually destroying a wetland that's built up there over 100 years, and you're going to destroy a bird breeding habitat. So guess what? Those bits of paper are still stuck on that farm, because when the water flows, it doesn't get anywhere because they haven't dealt with that. So so the environment gets what we get. So everyone talks about in the next drought, we can't see South Australia go backwards. We need to make sure South Australia or downstream gets all this water. The problem is, in the next drought, if it doesn't rain, you're not going to get any water. You've got a piece of paper, but you're not going to get any water because that piece of paper doesn't create rain. The water that they do own as well can't be used for anything but the environment. So when I hear the South Australians go, you've got to get the 450 because that will secure Adelaide's water supply. Nuh-uh. That would be breaking the law. You're not allowed to use that 450 for Adelaide's water supply unless they actually go into exceptional circumstances. That 450 has to go out to sea. Adelaide can turn on its desal plant, but it doesn't need the 450 to do that. Hope that answered your question.
Senator Robert Hardy from NBN, but also Farm Riders. If you were God tomorrow and you were the water minister...
What do you mean, if?
Well, you know, barring an election or something, I guess, changing sides. If you were in charge and you had a blank sheet of paper and you wouldn't necessarily turn back the clock, but you were the one and you could design this all in your own image from today, what would it look like?
I've put a lot of thought into that.
That wasn't a Dorothy Dixon.
Because I hope that happens one day. And as you say, you can't unscramble an egg. You know, there's a lot of people who go, why did we separate land and water? Well, you know, that argument been had, too late, too bad, cannot go back. But what I would do is there is a legislated review of the basin plan. So I would actually halt progress on the current plan as it stands. I'll say we've got 2,100 gigs of held water. We've got all these project plans in the work. I would allow work to continue on those infrastructure projects. And then I would review the science. Because one thing that hasn't happened, when the basin plan was drafted, they put all these assumptions into the models about what flow rates they hoped they would achieve. And what we've now discovered through 13 years of learning and through talking to communities and actually getting on the ground, and when I talked to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, some of the flow rates are not achievable at all. So if you're not targeting that flow rate, do you need that much water? So I want to go back and get the models out and put the reality in the models and say, let's run the model with the reality and see how much we need. Because as I said at the outset, we can do this, we can get better environmental outcomes. I think we've got enough water. The Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder has learnt a lot of hard lessons over 13 years. They are doing great things with their water. They are also doing great things with some of the infrastructure operators throughout the basin, like Renmark Irrigation Trust, Murray Irrigation and Colliambler Irrigation, where they're actually using existing infrastructure to target water deliveries onto wetlands, to create bird breeding events, to create fish breeding events, and they don't have to flood everywhere, which would just cause problems. So that's what I'd do. I'd bring it forward. I'd say if they're operating under the SDLs now, if they're not breaching the caps, we don't need to continue with water recovery. Let's focus on management. I want a Murray-Darling Basin management plan, not a water recovery plan.
Thanks, George, and thanks, Minister. My name's Andrew
I
Taylor.
wish I was Minister. I'm just a
Senator,
shadow.
Minister to
I'm
be.
just a shadow of myself.
Yeah. Andrew Tout from Centuria. This might sound like a bit of a silly question, but when I left school, drove from Narrabri out to Burke, Terrell. That was my first job. Then worked at Tandau. All those places that no longer have water. I've worked across the whole Murray-Darling Basin, and I just look at all these bloody storages, all this infrastructure. I wonder why the hell that isn't incorporated into the system, and why they're not actually, in every high flow event, making sure every farmer that wants to fill their storage can fill it, and that can be held as environmental water, and then pumped out, and the government can pay for it. Has that been considered?
Because that's called floodplain harvesting, and that's a whole nother conversation in New South Wales. And it is like it's like there's two versions of the world. You've got the Northern Basin, Queensland, Northern New South Wales, where they have a lot of on-farm storages. Most of it is predominantly private storages, and it's very opportunistic water harvesting. And then you've got the south, where it's highly regulated. Like my husband rings up, puts his water order in, and 4 days later he knows it's trickling through his gates. That's how regulated it is. The issue is everyone wants accountability. 100% we want accountability, and there's still conversations in the Northern Basin about how you actually account for what's what, and if if you're getting at floodplain, it doesn't necessarily come in that way. And the other issue you have is, as much as I love farmers, I'm married to one, and they are all very good people, but if things are dry and they've got a crop in the ground, they're probably not going to go, oh, but that's the environmental bucket. Just saying. So they're private storages, so it's really difficult to control what happens in a private storage. What we are doing, or what the New South Wales government has just done, is finally license those private storages so we actually can know exactly how much is going into them, so we know how much is left in the river. So we've got better accounting. But it's really hard. It's like I will never tell a farmer what they should or shouldn't grow on their land. I won't tell a farmer how they should or shouldn't use their water if it's in their private storage. And I would encourage any of the water market gurus in the room to develop that that trading scheme. There are certainly philanthropic organisations who operate in the water market as well, and I do know that Chew now leases water up above the Narran Lakes, where they do ask for farmers to do that. It's working. The Chew has gone to government with a proposal to allow some sort of a leaseback arrangement. The government, though, at this stage wants to just buy it and own it.
Senator, thanks very much for your time and your speech. My name's Angus Whitley. I'm from Bloomberg News in Sydney. The New South Wales Chief Scientist partly blamed degradation of the ecosystem of the river for the 20 to 30 million fish deaths in Menindee in March. How do you prevent another one of those disasters at the same time as fulfilling the demands that you've just spoken about, keeping the farmers happy and the communities happy and not buying back water?
Yeah, look, and it's really important to... fish deaths happen. It's an unfortunate natural occurrence. They do happen. Sometimes they're exacerbated by our own activities. Sometimes it's just through... on the Murray River, we've seen massive fish deaths, which are less reported because they float up and then they float downstream and then they wash out to sea. So you don't see the same imagery that you get around Menindee. But there are options of how to manage fish deaths, and one of them around Menindee is allowing fish passage would be one of the easiest things. Not cheap. Fish passages aren't cheap. I don't know who designed them, but he must be getting them lots in royalties. And there are other alternatives. So I know in my section of the river, on the Edward River, whenever we have a blackwater event, which happens quite regularly and does lead to fish deaths, and the crayfish all come marching out of the river, it's a bit like something out of an apocalypse movie. But and then the Commonwealth Environmental Waterholder works with Murray Irrigation to deliver fresh oxygenated water into refuges, into select sites throughout the system, which just provides a refuge for long enough until the water sort of shandies down. There are other options. There are, and I've seen farmers do it, where they go and they just get a pump and they chuck the pump in to just bubble the water to create an oxygenated patch. So there are options. We'll never get rid of fish deaths. One of the leading causes, as well as all the riparian issues, the water quality issues, but also 2 years before the most recent Menindee fish deaths, we had a very successful Commonwealth-led fish breeding event. So all of a sudden we bred all these fish to then die. But primarily it is dealing with cold water pollution, it's dealing with oxygenation, and it's dealing with fish passage. Because if the fish can't get out, they've got nowhere to go, and we will see more of what we saw. And I also remind people that in the last 2 Menindee fish deaths that we saw, one was caused by extremely low water, because we were in the middle of the drought, the Darling was disconnected, and the fish were all reserved in remnant pools. But the next one, we had massive floods everywhere. We had so much water coming into the system, and some of the water was full of tannins and nutrients, and we still had fish deaths. So is the answer add more water, or is the answer manage the water we've got better? My neighbour from Griffith.
Yeah, so Mark Senator from Terrag in Griffith. We're a rural supplies store in the MIA. I guess my question is, what is the tipping point in gigalitres giving back to the environment that towns like Deniliquin, Griffith, Darlington Point, Jerilderie, Finley start closing down? Has anyone done the research on that, the economic tipping point where we leave? Because we've got growers who are now not going to grow rice because water's too expensive, and grapes are out of the question because they're not worth anything either. So what's the number?
Look, I wish I knew. When you talk to communities, some communities say they're already there. There's a irrigation district down by me, Warcool Irrigation District. 50% of the original water licences on issue in that region have been transferred to the environment. Their demand has not suppressed. They're still growing. They're growing more efficiently, but they're also making a lot of use of the temporary market, so it adds to the pressure. Back in 2010, 2011, a lot of work was done to evaluate where communities were. As I said, in my town, 90% irrigation dependent. That work was done, and then it was put on a shelf and ignored. Then we've had other reports, like Robbie Sefton came out and did a report on what the economic impact has been, and she found that there has been a significant negative economic impact in a lot of irrigation dependent communities. That report was produced, we looked at it, the new government pretends it doesn't exist, but it comes back to also what is the benchmark, and this was one of the biggest problems with the original Basin Plan. They had an environmental benchmark, they had an environmental baseline model, they had nothing to benchmark the social and economic fabric of the areas. The MDBA spent an awful lot of money. They got a bloke called Phil Townsend, and he travelled the basin high and low, sat down with people, spoke to people, and did a power of work to actually evaluate from 2012, when the Basin Plan started, to I think it was published in 2014-15, what the impact had been. The MDBA put it on their website. It was an interactive map. You could click on Warcool, you could see the entitlements lost, you could see the jobs lost. That work has disappeared into the ether. It's gone, and I don't think anyone really wants to talk about it because they don't want to admit that I think we're at the tipping point in many of our smaller communities. I mean, towns like Griffith have done amazing looking at economic diversity, but towns like Griffith also have a variety of water products. They've got a variety of, economic basis, whereas Deniliquin's very much a broadacre cropping area, and you go downstream to Wentworth and it's very much a high security permanent plantings. There's not that same variability. Places like Griffith and Shepparton will survive. Places like Deniliquin, Renmark, Dirranbandi, they're the places that are going to struggle.
That's good. I've invested a lot of money in Griffith, so I'm sure the bank will be happy to hear that comment. But yeah, look, I think what you're saying today is that we should be slowing down our investment and buying water and jumping on the government's piggy. Let's get the money off the government.
I've worked in water for a very long time, and I will never advise anyone on how to buy or sell or what to do with water. I'll leave that to Lex and my mate John Armstrong and others, because they're much smarter than I am when it comes to this.